Hello! Thank you for joining us once again for Reading with a Ranger. Today I will be reading The American Revolution from A to Z by Laura Crawford and illustrated by Judith Herstein. A is for the American Revolution. Also called the Revolutionary War, this 8-year fight was the beginning of the United States of America. Until then, the 13 colonies were ruled by England. Colonists fighting for freedom were called patriots. B is for the battles of Lexington and Concord. These battles in Massachusetts began the American Revolution. The shot heard round the world was fired at Lexington in April of 1775. The night before, Paul Revere rode his horse from Boston to Lexington. Some say the shouts of "The British are coming! The British are coming!" warned the colonists of danger. C is for the colonies. The original 13 colonies lined the Atlantic Ocean. Representatives from the colonies met at the Second Continental Congress in 1775 to talk about the future of the new country. George Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. D is for the Declaration of Independence. Using a quill and a bottle of ink, Thomas Jefferson spent 17 days in a small room in Philadelphia writing this document, which stated that the colonies wanted freedom from England. He rewrote it several times, and with suggestions from Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, he finished in July 1776. 56 patriots signed it. E is for England. King George III ruled during the American Revolution. England needed money, so the Stamp Act was passed. This stated that the colonists had to buy stamps to pay taxes on paper products, such as legal documents, playing cards, and newspapers. The colonists refused to pay these taxes. F is for Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a very important founding father. He helped write both the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. Franklin traveled to England and France to negotiate peace. He was an author, scientist, and inventor who experimented with electricity. Franklin started the first police and fire department, public library, and post office. G is for George. General George Washington led the Continental Army to victory. He was elected President of the United States of America in 1789. He did not want to serve a second 4-year term, but was persuaded to do so. He is called the Father of our country. H is for Hancock. John Hancock was a wealthy patriot who started a boycott of British tea. Colonists were angered that they had to pay taxes on the tea, so they boarded 3 ships and dumped boxes of tea into Boston's harbor. This was known as the Boston Tea Party. Years later, Hancock's signature was the largest on the Declaration of Independence because he wanted King George III to be able to see his name without his glasses. I is for Independence Hall. Located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, this building is where the colonial leaders met to discuss the future of the new country. The Declaration of Independence was adopted here on July 4th, 1776. J is for Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the United States, was the main author of the Declaration of Independence and the third president. He was a lawyer, architect, writer, inventor, and musician. Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. K is for the Battle of the Kegs. On January 6, 1778, English warships were in the Delaware River in Philadelphia. Colonists filled small kegs with gunpowder and sent them floating downstream. The plan was to destroy the British ships, but when the kegs exploded, little damage was done. L is for the Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell is located in Philadelphia. The huge bronze bell weighs over 2,000 pounds and has a 24-inch crack. It was rung on July 8, 1776, after the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence. N is for Minutemen. Patriot soldiers ready to fight in 60 seconds were called Minutemen. Most used guns called muskets. The Army included untrained citizen soldiers such as farmers, shopkeepers, and blacksmiths. N is for Navy. The Patriot did not have a strong navy, but the British did. In 1779, John Paul Jones led the colonist ship the Bonhomme Richard in the battle against a British ship. Jones' ship was hit and began to sink. His crew bravely fought. Finally, the Patriots boarded the British ship and Jones took command of it. O is for Old Glory. Old Glory is a nickname for the American flag. 13 red and white stripes represent the colonies. A circle of white stars was sewn on a blue square. Stars were added for each new state. Some people think Betsy Ross sewed the first flag, but it was probably created by Francis Hopkinson. P is for Molly Pitcher. When Mary Hayes' husband went to fight in the war, she came too. One hot day in 1778, soldiers in battle were collapsing from the heat. Mary carried pitchers of water to the exhausted and thirsty men. At one point, she took over firing a cannon for her husband. Women who carried water to soldiers became known as Molly Pitchers. Q is for Quincy, Massachusetts. John Adams and his family lived in this city south of Boston. Adams was the first vice president and the second president of the United States of America. His wife Abigail urged him to include women's rights in the Declaration of Independence. Their son, John Quincy Adams, later became the 6th president. R is for Redcoats. Redcoats, or lobsterbacks, were nicknamed used to describe British soldiers who wore red uniforms. Well dressed and trained for war, the British Army was much larger and better prepared than the Patriot Army. The English also hired German soldiers called Hessians. S is for spy. Lydia Durag, a brave colonist, was forced to allow British soldiers in her Philadelphia home. She secretly listened as they planned an attack on the Patriots. She had to warn George Washington, so she walked several miles carrying an empty flour sack, pretending to run errands. She shared the plans with a Patriot soldier who quickly informed Washington. T is for traitor. A traitor is someone who betrays his country. General Benedict Arnold worked closely with George Washington. After becoming angry with American officers, he gave the British information on how to overtake West Point, an American fort, in exchange for money. U is for the United States Constitution. In 1787, 40 men from 12 of the newly formed United States signed the U.S. Constitution at Independence Hall. This plan divides our government into 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. V is for Valley Forge. Valley Forge was a camp in Pennsylvania for George Washington's army. When the men arrived in the cold, harsh winter of 1777-1778, they were hungry and sick and wore tattered clothes. After several months of training, here the Continental Army was far more skilled and united. W is for women. Women are important in the American Revolution. 21-year-old Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man named Robert Shirtliff and enlisted in the Continental Army. She continued to fight after being shot and hit in the head with a sword. When she was suffering from a fever, a doctor discovered that Robert was a woman. She was sent home from the war. X is for Henry Knox. General Henry Knox knew a lot about weapons. At one point, he was in charge of about 120 cannons and 500 Patriot soldiers. On Christmas night, 1776, George Washington crossed the Delaware River to Trenton, New Jersey. In a sneak attack on Hessian soldiers that was directed by Knox, 1,000 soldiers and their supplies were captured. Knox later became America's first Secretary of War. Y is for Yorktown. The Battle of Yorktown took place in Virginia in 1781. With help from the French, the American Army surrounded the British troops. After a few days of fighting, a British band and an officer surrendered by carrying a white flag. The war was almost over. Z is for Betty Zane. In 1782, British soldiers and Shawnee Indians attacked Fort Henry in Virginia. 16-year-old Betty Zane ran back to her cabin to get more gunpowder for the Patriots. The British and Indians realized that what she was doing and shot at her. She returned safely with the gunpowder, which helped the Patriots win one of the final battles of the American Revolution. The end.